When I moved into Maple Grove Estates, I expected the usual adjustment pains, figuring out where the closest grocery store was, how early the neighbors liked to mow their lawns, and which trash day belonged to which color bin. What I didn't expect was a knock on my door at 9:43 p.m. on my very first night, followed by the blinding flash of red and blue lights piercing through my living room curtains. 2 uniformed officers stood at my doorstep. "Sir, we received a report of a disturbance," one of them said, his tone calm but firm. "Your neighbor claims you were yelling threats across the fence." I blinked. "What?" "I just finished unpacking my bookshelves." The officers exchanged a knowing glance. "Mind if we come in to confirm everything's okay?" Of course, they found nothing. No raised voices, no chaos. Just cardboard boxes and the scent of takeout Chinese. They apologized, said they were just following protocol, and left with a hint of embarrassment in their eyes. That was my first introduction to her. Her name was Madeline Crow, and she wasn't just a neighbor. She was the self-proclaimed queen of Maple Grove. President of the HOA, chair of the beautification committee, and if gossip was to be believed, the unofficial mayor of the block. The kind of woman who smiled with her teeth but judged with her eyes. And it seemed I had landed squarely in her crosshairs. The next morning, I found a neon yellow envelope taped to my mailbox. Inside was a printed letter. No signature, but reeking of passive aggression. "Dear resident, please be advised that porch lights must not exceed 60 lumens after 9 p.m. to maintain neighborhood harmony. HOA Enforcement Committee." 60 lumens? My porch light barely lit up the welcome mat. I tried to shrug it off. First week weirdness. Maybe they were just really strict about appearances here. But the notes kept coming. Monday, my lawn was 2 inches taller than community standard. Wednesday, my trash bins were not aligned properly at curb. Friday, a fine for leaving a garden hose visible from the sidewalk. Each envelope bore the same tone. Authoritarian, impersonal, and always unsigned. I began to feel like I was being watched. Not just observed, but monitored. Like I was some kind of unwelcome variable in a perfectly curated social experiment. One evening, as I watered my flower beds, I noticed her. Standing on her porch across the street. Arms folded, eyes narrow. Not even pretending to look away when I caught her staring. That was Madeline Crow. "You might want to check the mailbox," she called out, her voice as sweet as syrup over poison. "The HOA doesn't look kindly on non-compliance." That night, the note was for a decorative wind chime, exceeding acceptable volume levels. It didn't take long for me to realize this wasn't about rules. It was about control. She didn't want peace. She wanted obedience. I started asking around, casually chatting with other neighbors during my morning jogs. Most avoided the topic. One woman, Laura Bennett, hesitated before whispering, "Just keep your head down." She has a way of making life hard for people who don't follow her lead. "What kind of way?" I asked. Laura looked around nervously before saying, "Let's just say 2 families moved out last year after disputes with Madeline. She gets what she wants, always." That night, I couldn't sleep. My blinds were drawn, lights off, but I swore I saw her silhouette pass in front of my house. Just a shadow, slow and deliberate, like a warning. The next morning, I received something new. Not a yellow envelope this time. A white one, embossed with the HOA seal. It felt heavier in my hand. More official. More final. Inside was a printed letter. "Dear homeowner, after review, your property has been deemed non-compliant with community aesthetic standards. Repeated infractions, including but not limited to lighting, landscaping, and exterior decor, have forced the HOA to take action. You are hereby notified that steps have been initiated to remove you from the community. You have 30 days to vacate the premises or face further legal escalation. Sincerely, Maple Grove HOA Enforcement Division." I laughed out loud at first, because it was absurd. I owned my house outright, no mortgage, no landlord. No way the HOA had the authority to evict a legal homeowner. But as my eyes skimmed to the final line, the laughter died in my throat. Failure to comply may result in foreclosure proceedings. Foreclosure. That wasn't just a scare tactic. HOAs, I knew, had ways of abusing fines, stacking penalties, and exploiting loopholes in community charters to drive people out financially. I'd read the horror stories. Some were just like this. But Madeline didn't know something. Something critical. The house she lived in? I owned that. She wasn't just my overbearing HOA president. She was my tenant. And with that realization, the game changed. It would have been easy to strike then and there. March across the street, drop the lease termination papers in Madeline's perfectly manicured hands, and watch her empire crumble like a sandcastle at high tide. But something told me to wait. Madeline Crowe wasn't just a petty tyrant. She was calculating, manipulative, and more dangerous than I'd originally thought. If she was willing to abuse HOA authority to evict a legal homeowner, what else was she capable of? I needed proof. Not just for the eviction, but for something bigger. So, I started digging. The next morning, I walked into the monthly HOA meeting like I belonged there. The community center was a cozy beige box with bad lighting and the smell of burnt coffee. Residents milled around folding chairs, some looking tired, others wary. And then, she walked in, heels clicking, clipboard in hand, eyes scanning the room like a general surveying the battlefield. Madeline took her seat at the head of the table, flanked by two silent board members who looked more like reluctant captives than colleagues. Her voice was smooth, polished, authoritative. Let's begin. First on the agenda, enforcement measures for non-compliant residents. I listened, took notes, even recorded the meeting on my phone tucked discreetly in my jacket pocket. And what I heard chilled me. Madeline had rewritten several community bylaws, without a vote. One board member, Mr. Clancy, tried to raise a concern about transparency, but was quickly shut down. Clause 8B grants the HOA president emergency amendment privileges in cases of urgent community interest, Madeline snapped. That clause was meant for storm damage, Clancy muttered. Madeline didn't blink. Lawn violations can be just as damaging. Chaos spreads. I held my breath. This wasn't about beautification. It was about control. And now I had her voice, recorded, confirming she'd bypassed due process. Still, I wasn't satisfied. I needed more. Over the next week, I spoke to other neighbors under the guise of introducing myself. Most were polite, but guarded. A few avoided eye contact entirely. Finally, I knocked on Laura Bennett's door. She answered, her eyes darting past me before she whispered, "You shouldn't be here." "I just want to talk," I said. "Off the record." She hesitated, then stepped aside. Inside her home, Laura lowered her voice. "Last year, my husband planted a peach tree in our backyard. Madeline said it violated the uniform landscape aesthetic. We got fined weekly until he gave in and cut it down." I clenched my jaw. Did she have the authority? Laura shook her head. "She wrote that policy herself. We never voted on it. But every time someone pushes back, she finds a way to bury them in fines or paperwork." Then she added, eyes wide, "You know, the family before you? They vanished. No for sale sign, no moving truck. Just gone." And 3 days later, Madeline was giving a tour to a new couple. That wasn't just intimidation. That was removal. And then came the breaking point. Late Thursday night, I returned home from a business meeting to find a large manila envelope stuck in my front door. This one wasn't passive-aggressive. It was aggressive-aggressive. A legal-looking packet, stamped again with the HOA's seal. Final notice of non-compliance. Pursuant to Maple Grove HOA Code 14A, due to continued failure to conform with established community standards, the HOA has initiated formal steps toward involuntary removal. Continued resistance may result in escalated legal and financial consequences, including, but not limited to, daily fines, lion placement, foreclosure proceedings. You have 30 days to vacate. I stood there in silence, rereading every word, feeling the rage build in my chest. This wasn't just harassment. This was war. She was trying to push me out, just like the others, using made-up rules, made-up power, and a facade of legitimacy to control everything around her. But this time, she had picked the wrong target. Because unlike the others, I wasn't going to run. I spent the entire night combing through public HOA filings, state housing codes, and legal forms. By sunrise, I had 3 things. Proof. Madeline had altered HOA bylaws without proper vote or notification. Multiple audio recordings from board meetings confirming overreach. A signed airtight lease agreement with my name listed as the property owner of Madeline's home. And buried deep in that agreement were 3 clauses she had clearly violated. Clause 6.2. Tenant shall not engage in behavior that harasses or threatens other residents. Clause 7.4. Tenant shall not make unauthorized structural or decorative changes to the property. Clause 10.1. Tenant shall not engage in actions that interfere with the legal rights of the property owner. All checked, all documented. I stared at her lease, my name bold at the top, and laughed bitterly. She had no idea the net she tried to cast around me had only wrapped tighter around herself. But I wasn't going to act yet. Not until everything was in place. The next morning, I called my lawyer and had him draft a formal notice of lease termination for breach of contract. I printed it on heavy paper, embossed with the legal firm's letterhead, and slipped it into a thick folder. This wasn't going to be an email. This needed to be personal. Because the moment Madeline Crow opened that envelope, I wanted to be there to see the exact second she realized. She was living in my house. And she was no longer welcome. The sun was high when I stepped out of my house, the folder tucked tightly under my arm. Every step toward Madeline's front door felt like a silent drumbeat of justice. For weeks, I'd been on the defensive, dodging fines, fielding threats, and unraveling the quiet chaos she'd sown throughout the neighborhood. But today, I wasn't the target. I was the reckoning. Madeline Crow stood on her porch like a queen surveying her kingdom. She was in the middle of berating a teenage boy about the unauthorized color of his skateboard. The poor kid stood frozen as she waved a laminated copy of HOA Code Section 4.3 in his face. When she saw me approaching, her expression shifted with startling precision. Disdain twisted into smugness. "I assume you've received the final notice," she said, folding her arms, her tone dripping with condescension. "I did," I replied calmly. "And I've brought a response." Her eyes flicked to the folder in my hand. "It's too late for appeals, Mr. Turner. The board's decision is final. You can't be allowed to disrupt the harmony of this community." I smiled, not out of politeness, but anticipation. "Oh, I'm not appealing anything. I'm enforcing my rights." I handed her the document. She raised an eyebrow and opened the folder, scanning the top line. Then the next, then the next, and then, her eyes froze. Notice of lease termination. Reason: breach of contract, sections 6.2, 7.4, and 10.1. Landlord: Jack Turner. Tenant: Madeline Crow. The color drained from her face like a wave pulling back from shore. This is a mistake," she stammered. "You're not my landlord. I deal with a management company." "Which I own," I interrupted, keeping my voice even. "Your lease has been under my property group for the past 2 years. It was part of an investment package I bought before moving here. I didn't even realize it until you tried to evict me from a home I own." She blinked rapidly, her mouth moving but no sound coming out. I watched the exact moment realization hit her like a freight train. Her empire wasn't just cracking, it was crumbling beneath her heels. You can't do this. I have rights." "Yes, you do," I nodded. "And you violated them. You harassed other residents. You installed signage on the lawn without permission. You tried to interfere with the legal rights of a property owner, me." She tried to recover, squaring her shoulders. "This isn't over. The HOA has no jurisdiction over landlord-tenant law," I cut her off, eyes narrowing. "This isn't about HOA drama anymore. This is a legal matter. Your lease is terminated. You have 30 days. Her hands shook as she clutched the papers, and her voice dropped to a trembling whisper. "You wouldn't actually evict me." I leaned in slightly, locking eyes with her. "I would have preferred peace, but you chose war. So yes, Madeline, I absolutely would." And then I walked away. I didn't need to look back. I could feel the silence behind me, heavy, stunned, and utterly defeated. But of course I knew Madeline wouldn't go quietly. The next morning, I received an email from the HOA's Compliance Division. Subject: Violation of HOA bylaws. Unauthorized eviction notice. It has come to our attention that you, Mr. Turner, have engaged in retaliatory eviction practices against a member of this community. Any further action will result in fines and potential legal escalation. I actually laughed out loud. She was trying to weaponize the HOA against me. Again. Only this time she was the tenant, and I had the law firmly on my side. I drafted a response, measured and professional, but with enough edge to make my point. Dear HOA compliance team, thank you for your concern. However, Madeline Crow is not merely a community resident. She is my tenant. As the legal property owner, I have terminated her lease in accordance with state housing laws due to multiple documented violations. Any further interference by the HOA in this legal matter may constitute harassment and will be met with formal legal action. Regards, Jack Turner, property owner. I hit send and leaned back, letting the satisfaction wash over me. But Madeline still had one card left to play. That afternoon, there was a knock at my door. When I opened it, 2 police officers stood on the porch, again. Mr. Turner, we received a report that you're unlawfully evicting a resident, one officer said, his voice polite but firm. I sighed. Let me guess. Madeline Crow? They nodded. I invited them in, just like before. This time, I was ready. I showed them everything. Her signed lease, the violation clauses, the photos of her unauthorized signage, the HOA emails, even the audio recordings from the board meetings. They reviewed it all carefully. This is airtight, one officer finally said. She's in clear breach. His partner nodded. Sorry to bother you again. Some people think HOA rules overrule the law. They don't. As they stepped out, I heard one of them knock on Madeline's door. I didn't hear the entire exchange, but I did catch the end of it. Ma'am, this is not a police matter. This is a civil eviction. Don't call us again unless there's an emergency. That was the first crack in her armor. She wasn't invincible. She wasn't untouchable. And most importantly, she wasn't going to stop me. I filed the official eviction paperwork the next day. 30 days. That's all she had left. But knowing Madeline Crow, she wouldn't go without a storm. And I was more than ready for the hurricane. The first few days after I filed the eviction paperwork were eerily quiet. No mysterious envelopes. No angry emails. No HOA patrols scrutinizing my flower beds. But I knew better than to believe Madeline Crow had surrendered. Madeline wasn't the kind of person who accepted defeat. She was the type who clung to power like a drowning woman to a life raft, and when it started slipping from her grasp, she lashed out. So, I waited. And sure enough, the silence didn't last long. It started with a knock on my door one rainy afternoon. A man in a navy suit stood there, umbrella in one hand, a leather briefcase in the other. Mr. Turner, he asked. Yes? I'm with Channel 9 News. We received a tip from the HOA president that a local landlord was attempting to unlawfully evict a respected community member for personal revenge. Would you care to comment? I stared at him. Behind him, a camera operator stood under the drizzle, already recording. Of course, Madeline was trying to turn this into a media circus. I held back a laugh. You're welcome to film the truth, I said, pulling out a copy of her lease, violation records, and the court-filed eviction documents. She's not a victim. She's a tenant in breach of contract. The reporter's eyebrows lifted as he skimmed the paperwork. The camera stopped rolling shortly after. Strike one. That same evening, I received an email from the city's housing office. A complaint had been filed against me, accusing me of unsafe living conditions, tenant harassment, and, my personal favorite, retaliatory eviction stemming from racial and gender bias. It was a desperate move, but dangerous. Accusations like that stuck, even if they weren't true. I spent the next 2 days compiling every document, time-stamped email, inspection report, and maintenance invoice I had. I filed a full rebuttal with the housing board, complete with affidavits from my property manager and 2 other tenants who described me as respectful and responsive. By the end of the week, the case was dismissed for lack of evidence. Strike 2. But Madeline wasn't done yet. At the next HOA meeting, which I attended purely for damage control, she made her move. She walked in late, dressed to intimidate, dark red blazer, heels clicking like gunfire across the floor. She carried a folder thick with printed pages, and took her seat at the front with the poise of a queen reclaiming her throne. "I have new business to bring before the board," she announced. "Due to recent actions that have disrupted our community's harmony, I motion that Jack Turner be barred from attending further HOA meetings, and his rights as a homeowner be temporarily suspended pending review." There was a collective murmur. Even her loyal board members shifted uncomfortably. "You can't suspend a homeowner's rights," I said calmly from my seat. "Especially not without a vote. This isn't a dictatorship." Madeline smiled coldly. "The HOA charter gives us authority in matters of emergency disruption." "Emergency?" I scoffed. "You mean me enforcing my legal rights as your landlord?" A few neighbors whispered, confused. And that's when I stood up. "I am the legal owner of the house Madeline Crowe is living in," I said, loud and clear, "and she's being evicted for violating her lease. Not because of any personal vendetta. She's misusing her HOA role to cover her own misconduct." Gasps rippled through the room. One of the board members, a woman named Janice, who'd always looked uneasy around Madeline, leaned forward. "Is that true, Madeline? You're living in a home he owns?" Madeline's jaw clenched. Her silence said everything. Strike three. After the meeting, Laura Bennett approached me in the parking lot. "She's losing control," Laura whispered. "You can see it in her eyes. But be careful. She's not done yet." She was right. Because the next day, my security cameras caught Madeline sneaking onto my porch at 2 a.m., tampering with my motion sensor light. The footage showed her twisting the wiring, trying to disable it. I didn't call the cops immediately. Instead, I hired a private investigator. It was time to take the fight into her territory. Within days, the investigator uncovered a gold mine. Madeline had been collecting HOA dues and funneling a portion of the funds to a separate, unregistered account under the name Maple Harmony Committee, a group that didn't exist in any official paperwork. Fraud. Not petty fines. Not gossip. Real, prosecutable fraud. I sat with the evidence for an hour, thinking about how to use it. I could report her right away. Or I could use it as leverage. So I typed up a new letter. Not a lease termination this time, but a formal cease and desist, outlining every shady move she'd made, including the HOA fund diversion, the false complaints, and the media stunt. I didn't send it through email. I printed it, signed it, sealed it in an envelope, and waited. 2 days later, I saw her outside yelling at a delivery driver whose truck had parked too close to the sidewalk. I walked across the street and handed her the envelope. "What now?" she snapped, clearly exhausted. "Just something to think about before eviction day," I said with a calm smile. She opened it on the spot. Her eyes darted across the first paragraph, then the second. Then her hands started shaking. She looked up at me, and for the first time there was fear in her eyes. "This is blackmail," she whispered. "No," I said, stepping back. "It's reality. You can step down quietly. Leave my house peacefully. Or you can keep pushing this and find yourself in court for fraud. Your choice." She didn't respond. But I could tell. The walls were closing in. Madeline's reign was over. She just didn't know how to fall with grace. And as eviction day approached, the final storm was building. Eviction day dawned with a strange kind of stillness. The morning air felt charged, like the breath before a storm. Even the birds seemed to hold their songs in suspense, as if they too were waiting to witness the end of something long overdue. From my porch, I watched Madeline's house. My house. The curtains were still drawn, the porch light still on. But there were no signs of boxes, no moving truck, no packed car in the driveway. She hadn't prepared. She wasn't leaving. Not willingly. At precisely 10:05 a.m., a black and white sheriff's cruiser pulled into the cul-de-sac. 2 uniformed deputies stepped out, clipboard in hand, their movements brisk, practiced. They nodded at me silently before walking up to Madeline's door. I stood across the street, arms folded, heart steady. This was it. The end of her game. She opened the door slowly. Her lipstick was perfect. Her hair was neatly pinned. But her eyes were wild, and her hands trembled just slightly, just enough for me to notice. The lead officer spoke calmly. "Ma'am, we're here to execute a court-ordered eviction. You have 15 minutes to vacate the premises. Any personal belongings left behind will be removed by the cleanup crew." Madeline stared at them, stunned, as if waiting for the universe to suddenly bend in her favor. "This is my home," she said through gritted teeth. "You can't just throw me out like trash." The deputy didn't flinch. "No, ma'am. This is his home." He pointed directly at me. "And you've had 30 days. For a split second, I saw it, the flicker of reality finally piercing through her armor. But it didn't last. "I'll sue," she hissed, voice rising. "I'll bury you all in court." The other deputy stepped forward. "Ma'am, if you don't comply voluntarily, we'll be forced to place you under arrest for trespassing." That was the moment her carefully constructed world shattered. She slammed the door in their faces. Inside, I could hear chaos erupt, shouting, glass clinking. Then came a crash, something heavy being thrown. The officers looked at me. "Would you like to press charges if she causes damage?" one asked. I paused. Every part of me wanted to say yes, but I shook my head. Not unless she breaks something she can't replace. I just want her gone. 10 minutes passed, then 15. Finally, the door flew open. Madeline stomped down the front steps with all the fury of a fallen monarch. Her hair was disheveled, her eyes red. She carried a single overstuffed suitcase, its zipper barely holding together. She refused to look at me as she reached the curb. But then, as she opened her car door, she turned. "You think you've won," she snarled, voice hoarse. "But this neighborhood, this community, it was better under me, you'll see. Without structure, without rules, it all falls apart." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Because nothing I could say would match the silence of her defeat. She got in her car, slammed the door, and peeled out of the neighborhood without another word. The deputies secured the property. The locks were changed. I signed the final paperwork. It was over. Madeline Crow, the tyrant queen of Maple Grove, was gone. I stood alone on the porch of the house she once ruled, now quiet, still. For the first time since I moved in, the street felt peaceful. Later that afternoon, I received an email from the HOA board. Subject: Open seat on HOA board. Dear Mr. Turner, due to a recent vacancy, the Maple Grove HOA board is seeking nominations for a new member. As a valued homeowner and community contributor, we invite you to consider applying for the open seat. I stared at the screen, amused. They wanted me to take her place, to wear the crown she abused. I clicked mark as read and closed the laptop. No, I didn't want power. I wanted peace. But I did make one change. That night, I printed a flyer and posted it on the neighborhood bulletin board. No flashy graphics, no bold colors, just simple black text. Let's build a community, not a kingdom. HOA meeting, open forum. All voices welcome. Weeks passed. People started coming out of their shells. Neighbors who used to glance at each other with suspicion now stopped to chat. Front lawns bloomed with life, not just to meet a standard, but because people wanted to make their homes beautiful again. And Laura? She baked cookies and showed up at my door with a smile and an offer to help organize a block party. The first in 5 years. As for Madeline, rumor had it she moved across town, bought a condo. No HOA. Some said she was trying to run for her building's board of trustees. Some said she'd sworn off leadership forever. Either way, she was gone. Her reign built on fear, silence, and manipulation had ended. And in its place, something better was beginning. Because if there's one thing I learned through all of this, it's this. True authority isn't about titles. It's about trust. And power? It doesn't come from fear. It comes from respect. In the end, the real victory wasn't just about reclaiming a house or silencing a tyrant. It was about reclaiming dignity. Mine, and that of an entire neighborhood that had been quietly suffering under the weight of one person's need for control. Madeline Crow thought power came from control, from fear, from rules twisted in her favor. But true strength, it comes from standing your ground with truth on your side. It comes from knowing when to fight back. Not with anger, but with wisdom, patience, and integrity. We often think battles in life are won with force, but more often, they're won with quiet resilience. When you know your worth and you refuse to be intimidated, that's when real change begins. Not just in your life, but in the lives of those around you. This wasn't just a story about an eviction. It was a story about courage, community, and the quiet revolution that begins when just one person dares to say, enough. So ask yourself, what would you do if someone tried to control your life, your peace, your home? Would you run, or would you rise? Because the truth is, we all have a Madeline somewhere in our lives. Someone who underestimates us, someone who oversteps. And maybe, just maybe, it's time we remind them. We don't bend to fear. We rise with purpose. If this story moved you, made you think, or reminded you of your own quiet strength, hit that like, subscribe, and follow the Story Forge for more powerful tales that reflect real-life lessons in unforgettable ways. And hey, drop a comment below. What would you do if the queen of your block tried to evict you from your own throne? Let's talk about it.